Most defendants accept their fate and move on, but when Pam Bondi was hit with a sudden fine, she fought back with such precision that even the judge questioned his own ruling. Pam never expected the day to start like this. Courtroom 3B in a Tampa courthouse was supposed to be just another quick hearing, nothing more. She'd been in this room dozens of times, facing judges with varying levels of experience. But today felt different. Pam sat at the defendant's table, her expression neutral, glancing through a few notes. Across from her, a city attorney adjusted his tie, waiting for the judge to enter. The case was minor, or at least, it was supposed to be, a procedural matter that wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. But when Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, Pam immediately sensed something was off. Dalton commanded the room without saying much. Tall, with a gray beard and deep-set eyes, he exuded an authority that was impossible to ignore. Normally, judges would take a moment to review files and settle in before making remarks. Not Dalton. Without hesitation, he addressed the court. His voice was flat, expression unreadable. The court has reviewed the matter at hand, and after considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $10,000, payable immediately. Silence. Pam's brow lifted slightly, but inside, her mind was already working. She had expected an argument, a discussion, maybe even a warning. But this? A summary judgment without any discussion? The city attorney glanced at her almost apologetically. He hadn't expected the case to move so fast. Pam calmly folded her hands. Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments. Dalton barely blinked. The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear. Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. This wasn't just about the case, it was about her. She straightened slightly, her voice firm but measured. If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. I request the opportunity to present my defense. Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had expected her to push back. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You're welcome to try, Miss Bondi, but I assure you the outcome will be the same. That's when Pam knew. This wasn't just about the case. It was about power. She glanced at the legal brief in front of her. She didn't need it. She already knew what she had to do. The fine itself wasn't the issue. The principle was. Pam met Dalton's gaze directly. Then I suppose we should get started. The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. The court stenographer repositioned herself. Even the spectators in the back leaned forward, sensing something unusual was about to unfold. Pam let the silence linger. She didn't rush or flinch. She turned a page in her folder before finally speaking. Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something. Her voice was steady. Are you saying that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding? Dalton's expression didn't change. I'm saying the violation is clear, and the fine stands. Pam tilted her head slightly, studying him. Interesting, she said, her tone casual. You see, I've been practicing law for quite some time, and in all those years, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it. It's, what's the phrase? Unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. Miss Bondi, this court does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands, and we move on. Pam gave a small, knowing smile. Very well. Let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated. She tapped her finger on the printed document. You say the law is clear, but that's interesting. This very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years, with varying interpretations. Dalton's eyes narrowed. The language in subsection C, Pam continued, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year, a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under this statute, without allowing for due process, constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom was completely silent. Pam could feel the shift happening, and Dalton knew it too. She continued, from where I'm sitting, it looks like those cases apply here. The language of the ruling in Reynolds v. Clearwater was pretty clear, An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words sink in before adding, and I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore precedent. Dalton clenched his jaw, but Pam wasn't done yet. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Miss Bondi? Pam exhaled a quiet laugh. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pam had subtly shifted the power dynamic. She had forced the judge to defend his position rather than simply issuing rulings without question. The city attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off. His eyes remained locked on Pam's. There was a long pause, then finally, the judge spoke. Very well. You may present your defense. Pam smiled, slightly. This wasn't a victory yet. It was just the beginning. But as she prepared to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear he wasn't going to make this easy. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. His gaze never left Pam's. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. It wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about control. He wanted to make sure she knew exactly where she stood in his courtroom. But Pam wasn't intimidated. Adjusting her posture, she kept her expression unreadable. Let's start with the language of the statute itself, she said, tapping her papers. Local Statute 14b. The statute claims that any entity failing to comply with municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough, but the issue arises in how compliance is defined. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, looking unimpressed. And yet, Miss Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly without issue. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She glanced at the city attorney, then back at Dalton. Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient? Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Miss Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. Pam allowed a beat of silence before responding, except when it isn't. A murmur rose from the back of the room. Pam reached for another document and held it up. Let's talk about Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg, she said. The defendant in that case was fined under this very statute, same wording, same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused for emphasis. You know what the judge said in that ruling? That the law, as applied, fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unenforceable under scrutiny. Dalton's expression remained blank, but the tension in his jaw said enough. The city attorney leaned in slightly. Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked. Pam turned her gaze toward him, cutting him off before he could continue. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please enlighten us. The attorney hesitated. His silence spoke volumes. Pam turned back to Dalton, respectfully. Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton sat back, scanning her, calculating. Pam knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, trying to find an angle to regain control. Finally, he spoke. The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours. Pam didn't even blink. True, but the precedent applies all the same. The law is either clear, or it isn't. Silence. The weight in the room had shifted. Pam knew she had the judge cornered, not just because he was legally wrong, though he was, but because she had forced him into a position where any decision he made now would be under scrutiny. He could push forward, ignore precedent, and risk having his ruling overturned, or he could backpedal, conceding that he had acted prematurely. Pam didn't envy his position, but then again, he was the one who had put himself there. Dalton let out a slow breath. Miss Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable. Pam smiled slightly. Then let's debate it. The judge's nostrils flared slightly, but to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. The court will take a 15-minute recess. He stood before anyone could argue, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. Pam set her papers down, her expression calm. But inside, she knew what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to give in, but he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone. And what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. 15 minutes felt like an hour. Pam remained seated at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the stack of papers in front of her. She wasn't reading them. She didn't need to. The legal precedents, the procedural arguments, the case law she had cited were all burned into her mind. She was ready. But something about Judge Dalton's abrupt recess didn't sit right with her. He wasn't the type to hesitate, which meant he was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't accounted for. The door to the judge's chamber swung open, and Dalton strode back in, a new presence by his side, a second judge, someone Pam immediately recognized, Judge Ellen Whitaker. A senior judge, higher ranking than Dalton. The moment Whitaker entered, the mood in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't standard protocol. Bringing in another judge mid-hearing wasn't just unusual, it was calculated. Pam adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Dalton cleared his throat. Before we proceed, I've requested that Judge Whitaker sit in on this matter. Requested? Pam didn't believe that for a second. Someone had pulled strings. Whitaker gave her a slow nod, his presence calm but authoritative. Miss Bondi, I understand you've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Statute 14b. Pam met his gaze evenly. That's correct. Whitaker clasped his hands in front of him. You believe this fine should be overturned based on appellate precedent? She didn't hesitate. I don't believe it. I know it. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitaker arched an eyebrow. I appreciate your confidence, but let's discuss specifics. You referenced Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a follow-up ruling later clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under localized judicial discretion? Pam kept her expression neutral, but inside, she felt the shift. So, that's what this was. Dalton had stepped back, brought in someone with more authority, and now they were attempting to counter her argument with an overlooked technicality. Pam folded her hands. I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor. But I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, something that, in this case, was not done. Whitaker nodded, as if he had expected her to say that. Then let's talk about that. The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam barely hid her surprise. She hadn't expected that, but she welcomed it. She turned her head as a man stood from the back of the room, Officer Brian Calloway, a municipal enforcement officer, middle-aged, dressed in a crisp navy uniform. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his decisions. Pam kept her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor, I would. Dalton gestured for Calloway to step forward. The officer made his way to the witness stand, took his oath, and sat down. Pam stood, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Officer Calloway, she began, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam turned slightly toward the jury box. The public sat in the gallery, watching, as Officer Calloway was sworn in to testify. Pam, standing before him, poised and deliberate, asked, on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred? Calloway exhaled as if the answer were obvious. The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back, her gaze steady. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? He hesitated. No, ma'am. It wasn't necessary. Pam's lips curled into a small, almost amused smile. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Calloway shifted in his seat. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw. Pam kept her expression calm, but inside she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. Turning back to the bench, she spoke firmly. Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual subjective assessment. This directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the appellate clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier. Whitaker's expression remained unchanged, but he sat back slightly. He knew she was right. Pam pressed forward. So I'll ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement? The silence in the room was deafening. Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench. He wasn't looking at Whitaker, and that told Pam everything she needed to know. He had expected to win this argument. He had expected Whitaker's presence to back her into a corner. But instead, she had taken his own counterpoint and used it to unravel the case against her. Dalton exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back. But when the court reconvened, what Dalton did next was something no one saw coming. Pam remained seated as the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Another recess? That wasn't a good sign for the judge. It meant he was struggling to regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. But Pam knew better than to celebrate too soon. Dalton was a man of authority, and if there was one thing people in power hated, it was being challenged. He wasn't going to back down that easily. When the court finally reconvened, Dalton's demeanor had shifted. Gone was the passive confidence he had walked in with earlier. Now his jaw was set, his expression unreadable. Whitaker was still seated beside him, though this time his posture was more reserved. It was clear he had no intention of intervening, at least not yet. Dalton cleared his throat. Miss Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments, his tone measured, but Pam could hear the tightness in it. He wasn't used to admitting even the smallest concession. However, this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands. Pam blinked once. That was interesting. So, he was doubling down. She exhaled slowly, nodding as if she were considering his words carefully. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court stenographer. Can you read back the last statement, please? The stenographer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, barely hesitated before repeating. The fine stands. Pam turned back to Dalton. Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof in direct contradiction to established appellate precedent? Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. Miss Bondi, this court has discretion. Pam's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It does. But discretion is not immunity from legal standards. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing where this was going. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the bench. Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion. Dalton's silence told her everything she needed to know. She turned to the gallery, sweeping her gaze across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders who had sat through the hearing. Imagine the implications of that. A business owner gets fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner is penalized for something they can't even verify. And if they challenge it? Too bad. The court has discretion. A few heads nodded subtly. Pam turned back to Dalton. That's not discretion, Your Honor. That's unchecked authority. The weight of her words sank into the room. Whitaker finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process. Pam nodded, her voice unwavering. Not just due process, but judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, the entire legal system starts to erode. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. He knew he had been backed into a corner. The city attorney finally interjected. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton held up a hand, his face unreadable, but Pam could see the frustration in his eyes. There was no winning this. Not for him. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, Dalton exhaled. This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement. His voice was stiff, almost reluctant. The fine is overturned. A murmur rippled through the room. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she stepped toward the exit, she heard Dalton's voice one last time. "Miss Bondi." She turned. Dalton's eyes met hers. "I underestimated you." Pam gave him a small smile. "You wouldn't be the first." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain: this case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. And somewhere, in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. Pam walked down the marble hallway, her pace steady but her mind still sharp. The weight of what had just happened wasn't lost on her. She had walked into that courtroom expecting a routine hearing. What she got instead was a battle of power, law, and ego. And she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget moments like these. They didn't like losing, especially not in front of a full courtroom. As she neared the courthouse exit, a voice called from behind. "Miss Bondi, a moment?" She turned to find Judge Whitaker approaching. His expression was still unreadable. He wasn't the kind of man who engaged in unnecessary small talk, so if he was stopping her now, it wasn't just to exchange pleasantries. Pam crossed her arms loosely. "Something on your mind, Judge Whitaker?" Whitaker studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're good." Pam smiled slightly. "I try." He nodded, glancing briefly at the courtroom doors behind him before lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. "I wasn't brought in to observe, Miss Bondi. I was brought in to contain." Pam raised an eyebrow. "To contain what exactly?" Whitaker exhaled, his eyes scanning hers. "Judge Dalton doesn't like losing. And in this case, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example." Pam already knew that, but hearing it confirmed only made the victory feel more significant. She kept her voice even. "So, what happens now?" Whitaker hesitated, then gave her a look that held both respect and warning. "You'll have people watching you, and not just here." Pam understood exactly what he meant. Today, she had done more than win a case. She had challenged the system that thrived on compliance. And that didn't go unnoticed. She nodded once. "I appreciate the heads up." Whitaker gave her one last look before stepping back toward the courtroom. Pam turned toward the exit, pushing the heavy courthouse doors open and stepping into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first time she had fought a battle in court, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was a lesson in today's fight. One she hoped others would see. Power wasn't about who sat behind the bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. It was about knowing the rules well enough to challenge them. It was about standing firm when others expected you to back down. And most importantly, it was about never assuming that just because someone handed you a ruling, you had to accept it. Pam Bondi had walked into that courtroom expecting a standard hearing. She walked out having reminded everyone, especially those in power, that the law wasn't just about enforcement. It was about understanding. It was about fighting back. And today, she had done just that.